Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today for this three-game slate for Thursday for college football, I'm just going to break down each team and give you who I think are the best picks from the team, and then I'll give you my top pick for each position as well. So overall, we have six teams to choose from: West Virginia, Virginia Tech, Coastal Carolina, Georgia State, and Chattanooga and Illinois. And in these particular games, the Illinois-Chattanooga game is expected to be a blowout by Illinois over Chattanooga, and so I don't really have much from Chattanooga because they're going to have some really tough sledding in this particular game. With that said, these other two games are extremely tight, and so I expect that these games to be to fit into the characterization of what we expect. And I think that all four teams have some good players that we can take from them in order to maximize their chances to win here on Daily Fantasy. So let's go ahead and get into the quarterbacks that I like. And so basically there's five quarterbacks that we can really take a look at here. And to start that off, I'm going to just start with West Virginia and go through each player here. So JT Daniels, I expect him to throw the ball around 35 times in this game, and I suspect somewhere between 200 and 250 yards and a touchdown or two through the air. They do tend to throw the ball pretty good and a little bit more than some of the other teams here. They don't run the ball as much as some of the other teams, and then even when they do, it's usually one of their wide receivers that does, and so I'll show you those guys here. At running back, we really only have one option on this team, and that's Mathis, and he runs the ball somewhere around 15 to 20 times a game, and so I suspect he'll get somewhere around the 15 attempts in this game. Depending on which team gets ahead early, it's going to dictate which team's running backs are going to run a little bit more. But I do think that West Virginia tends to throw slightly more than Virginia Tech, and so I like him in this particular situation as a running back, but he's not as I don't love him as much as I like some of the other guys, but his price is pretty inexpensive at $5,800, which, we need running backs underneath we need players under 6,250, so he's somebody you can consider. But I suspect 15 attempts, 50 yards, 50 to 60 yards, and maybe a touchdown in this particular game. And then as for the wide receivers that we have to choose from on this particular matchup, we have B. Ford Wheaton, which I suspect will get somewhere around 7 to 10 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown or two. He's the safest play from this team, and also on the board, in fact, when it comes to potential touchdown situation and just overall receptions in this particular game and on the entire slate. The other guy that is somebody to take a look at is Donaldson. Now, the difference with Donaldson is he doesn't really get a ton of receptions, but he does rush the ball about 10 times, and I suspect somewhere between 9 and 10 times this game, and a touchdown or two, along with probably somewhere between 50 and 75 yards based on the situation here. And so I think that there's a pretty good upside to him simply because he'll rush the ball some, and he'll probably get a reception or two throughout the game. But he tends to have a better rushing situation than Mathis does, and they kind of are in a timeshare on it. So I suspect both those guys are going to have some value. But Donaldson definitely gains more value simply because he only averages, his price is $4,300. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry about that. And then finally, Sam James is the other guy I was going to mention here. Now, he doesn't get as many touches. I expect him to get 4 to 5 receptions with 50 yards, but he does have touchdown potential in this game, and I think he's somebody to take a consideration on this particular slate. However, he's probably my least favorite of the options on West Virginia of the three that I mentioned. So, with that said, I think West Virginia is a really solid team to take a look at when it comes to fantasy this week. They are favored to win the game by 2.5 points, and I think that that's going to help as well. And it looks like both of these teams are going to stay on the field most of the game, so they definitely have some upside in their situations. The Virginia Tech team, so our quarterback is Garrett Wells, and I have him somewhere between 25 and 35 total attempts, around 225 yards, and probably a touchdown. And then overall, I don't like him as much as I like JT Daniels in this particular matchup, and they're virtually the same price. So that's kind of what you're getting at here. He doesn't seem as accurate either, and you do have to overlook this Woodford game a little bit where he threw 314 yards. I think it's going to be more likely like his first two games where he gets 100, where he's going to throw the ball a little bit more because of the matchup, but he's going to get 200 or so yards in this particular one, and so I like him in this situation. I also think that JT Daniels has more touchdown upside than Wells does. At running back, we have a bit of a situation, so we don't know if Malachi Thomas is going to be the starter. If he is, then he's going to be our top running back, probably on the slate, in fact, because he's their top back. But if he doesn't play, and then King, who's probable, does play, then he's one of the best options on the slate. But the question about that is which guy is going to go. And then if neither of them play, then Holston will be the starter. And he's not he has some touchdown potential, but he's not a great running back by average and all that kind of stuff. So overall, whoever starts this game, whether it be King or Thomas or Holston, if it's Holston, I'd probably passing on this running back situation. If it's King, then I'll probably roster him, and if it's Thomas, then I'll probably roster him. I think that's kind of how you have to take a look at this. Unfortunately, we probably won't know until closer to the game itself, because they haven't released any information on the probability of Thomas being back. It looks like he was pretty close to being back according to the last week's situation, so we'll see what happens against in this week closer to the slate. But that said, all three of them are pretty inexpensive for running backs, and so whoever it is in a plus situation like this where they're going to get 20 rushes, King or Thomas will be relatively safe on this particular slate. At wide receiver, we really don't have a lot here because Wells really does throw the ball around, and he doesn't really hit anybody all that often. Really the most consistent guy, and it's not very consistent. As you can see, he's got 6 total receptions on the season, is Gosnell. But all of their receivers, they're just around 6, 7, 8. I think the most is 9. So there's not anybody that's getting more throws than anybody else. And even in the tighter games, it's very, it's just, he's very spread out. He's hit a lot of wide receivers for, a few attempts. Now, this guy, he had some pretty good attempts in a couple games, but then in the Boston College game, he didn't do good. He tends to play when somebody else gets banged up a little bit. So it's really hard to gauge any wide receiver. If there is if there is somebody that I had to pick, I would probably just pick Caleb Smith simply because he has the most upside and the most consistency on the season. But none of them get enough yards to really make it super valuable. Like Gosnell, he gets some yards, but it's just there's nobody that's over the top great in this situation, and so I don't think that any of them are particularly worth taking a risk on. The only guy that's really, none of them have gotten more than a couple of touchdowns either, and so it's really hard to gauge who might get them this week. And so I think that wide receivers on Virginia Tech is probably going to be a pass. So for that game, we have G. Wells, and then either King or Thomas at running back, depending on who starts. For the Coastal Carolina game, we have some good options at quarterback and wide receiver. Our top quarterback is going to be McCall. Now, he's actually I expect him to get somewhere between 25 and 30 attempts and 250 or so yards. The touchdowns are going to be a little harder potentially in this game, but I still think that he's in a spot where he can get a couple, and he's gotten through each game so far this season, and in tight games, in fact, and he just has more upside on yards than some of the other quarterbacks on this particular slate, and so I think he's in a good spot. In fact, he's my top quarterback on the slate overall. Obviously, he's also the most expensive at $8,000. At running back on this team, we really don't have anybody that we love. Reese White has been the running back, but he's been very inconsistent when it comes to total attempts, and part of that is because Beasley had a really solid game in the third game. He gets more attempts, but he hasn't been as consistent when it comes to yards or touchdowns, and so I like neither of them in the timeshare. And not only that, but Braden Bennett may be back this week. We haven't found out yet. It seemed like he was close to being back last week, and so he might be back this week. And if he is, then that just throws a whole loop into the whole other thing. But if he is back, I think that he's somebody you would have to take a look at. He's a really good running back. And so if he is back, then he's somebody to use. But if he's not back, then I'm passing on the running backs from this team. But at wide receiver, we have a really good option here, and that's Mr. Pickney, Sam Pickney for Coastal Carolina. Now, he has been getting around 70 yards, and I think that he can get about 5 receptions for 75 yards and potentially a touchdown in this match. This game, it has the highest score on the game at 63.5 points, and Coastal Carolina is suspected to win by 2.5 points. So we have a tight game, and we have the top receiver on the team as a potential option in this particular game. The only other guy to even consider is Mobley, but he doesn't get really enough receptions or yards. He just has some touchdowns, which gives him some potential in this matchup. But honestly, I didn't like him all that much. This is my safe, but Pickney is definitely, I think, one of my top wide receivers on this board, and so I really like him in this particular matchup. For Georgia State, we have another quarterback that I like pretty good, is Granger. I expect him to get somewhere between 25 and 30 attempts thrown and 250 or so yards and 2 or 3 touchdowns. I think he has the highest touchdown potential of all the quarterbacks on the slate. This is going to be a tight game, as I said, 63.5 points, 2.5 point spread. I do think he's going to have to throw the ball more than McCall does, and probably not as favored to get as many yards as McCall, but is going to be somebody that I think has some upside in this particular game. One other advantage that he has over the other quarterbacks is that he does tend to rush the ball for about 50 yards, and sometimes he does get a touchdown, and I think he'll have some opportunity in this one. If you look at his past games, he played Charlotte, UNC, and South Carolina. Obviously, UNC and South Carolina are pretty tough teams for non-top tier conference teams to play, and then the Charlotte game is going to be something that's going to be more indicative of his potential in a game like this, and I look at him to probably replicate a similar aspect. Maybe not as many touchdowns or yards, but just as many rushing attempts and yards, and from that perspective. And so I like him in this particular matchup. Then at running back, we have 2 good options here. One of them being Greg, and the other one being Jay Williams. Now, Greg is supposedly he'll probably rush around 20 attempts in this game and get somewhere between 75 and 100 yards and potentially a touchdown. I think he's a really solid option at this position, and he's really inexpensive. But he is a little bit in the timeshare with Jameis Williams. Now, Williams does have tendency to get some attempts through the air, but he's going to get somewhere around 10 attempts on the ground for 55 or 65 yards. And I actually think he has a little bit more upside in this game than he had in the other games he's played. And so I think he's somebody to take a look at his $4,500 price tag. And then at wide receiver, we have several good options. Thrash being one of them. He's somewhere between 5 and 6 receptions for 55 to 100 yards. It's a little bit stretchy there. Maybe a little over 100 yards in a tight game here. And he has touchdown potential, but not as much as the other option on this team, which is Robert Lewis, who gets a few less receptions most games, but I look at him to get 5 or so receptions in this one, and he has a little higher potential in yards, around 75 to 100 yards, and then also a touchdown or 2, which he's a little bit better at touchdowns than Thrash is, and so that kind of helps him in the fantasy point aspect. But overall, I think both wide receivers on this team are somebody to take a look at, because Granger is going to have a better accuracy rating and have more yards to the air than McCall probably does. But that said, I think both quarterbacks in this game are pretty solid. And then for the other 2 teams, Chattanooga and Illinois, I really don't think anybody on Chattanooga is really that great to look at. I mean, Hutchinson is a pretty decent quarterback for them, but this is the first team that he's actually going to face. Is pretty tough. And he didn't even do that well in his first game against Wolford. So I don't really like anybody on Chattanooga very much, simply because it's going to be a tough sledding game. As for Illinois, the problem with DeVito is that he's going to be capped by a potential blowout. I look for him to get 25 to 30 attempts with around 200 yards in this particular game. And I don't really know, obviously he could get touchdowns, but I don't know that he's going to score as many points as some of the other quarterbacks. At running back, we have a little bit of a different situation. So Josh McCray may be out again. It doesn't look like he's going to play this week, from what I can tell. And so Chase Brown is going to be the main guy, and he's going to run the ball about 20 times, and he's probably going to get 130 or 150 yards and a touchdown or two potentially in this game. And if you look at the first two games against Wyoming and Virginia, he stayed in the game and ran 20 times and got a touchdown or two in one of them at least in both games, even though they were kind of blowouts. And so I look for him to have the opportunity to get up to 100 to 150 yards in this matchup. So I think he's somebody you can afford to take a risk on at his price tag of 6,900 too. He's somebody you got to take a look at for this particular matchup. He's not as safe because of the potential of blowout, but I still think he's in a good spot. And then at wide receiver, we have two good options. One of them being Isaiah Williams. Now the options on this game are a little bit riskier, simply because of the blowout situation, and they're probably going to end up throwing the ball to a lot of different guys more than in like the top guys. But Isaiah Williams is the top option for the team, and I look for him to get 6 or 7 receptions for about 50 yards. The only issue that he has is he's not a big yards guy, so that's a little bit of a risk. And then Pat Bryant, he's more likely to get a touchdown in this matchup, but he's only going to get 3 or 4 receptions for somewhere around 50 or 60 yards, I would estimate. I'm mostly including them because I think that there's some upside with them, especially early in this game, because it's going to be relatively easy for those guys to get open. But overall, this game, beyond them, it's going to be tough sledding, just from the perspective that nobody's going to get a ton of targets, and most of these guys are not really great at getting a ton of yards. So overall, I think there's a pretty solid slate. I think there's plenty of good options here. If I had to take my top quarterback is McCall. My top running back is Brown from Illinois, and my top wide receiver is Ford Wheaton from West Virginia. And then I think that you're going to be able to build out some really good teams and hopefully be able to cash pretty nicely on this particular slate. If you have any comments or questions, or if you feel like there's any players I may have missed, feel free to leave comments below, and make sure to join Discord. Have a nice day, guys.